Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Madam President. Our first session of the 118th Congress is coming to a close. But in the flurry of last-minute legislating, I want to call attention to one of the most important stories that I've read this year. Now, I don't want to ruin anyone's Christmas, but this isn't good news. It is deeply sobering. The Wall Street Journal article titled "Alarm Grows Over Weakened Militaries and Empty Arsenals in Europe" is what I would like to talk about it. And here's how it begins. Quote, "The British military, the leading U.S. military ally and Europe's biggest defense spender, has only around 150 deployable tanks and perhaps a dozen serviceable long-range artillery pieces. So bare was the cupboard that last year the British military considered sourcing multiple rocket launchers from museums to upgrade and donate those then to Ukraine, an idea that was dropped. France, the next biggest spender, has fewer than 90 heavy artillery pieces, equivalent to what Russia loses roughly every month on the Ukraine battlefield. Denmark has no heavy artillery, submarines, or air defense systems. Germany's army has enough ammunition for 2 days of battle," end quote. Madam President, the war in Ukraine has exposed just how serious our friends' readiness and supply problems are. Think about what I said. The largest defense spender in Europe has considered raiding museums for scraps of usable equipment. When it comes to heavy artillery, Russia blows through France's entire arsenal every month. At least Germany is prepared to do battle, as long as the war doesn't last longer than a 3-day weekend. Europe's bare cupboards problem began many years ago, at the end of the Cold War, when European nations began slashing defense budgets and drawing down troop numbers. Amazingly, the dire situation today is actually an improvement from 10 years ago. Since Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014, the European Union has increased defense spending by 20%. That is not nearly enough, and it's virtually nothing compared to our adversaries. Russia's spending increased by 300% and China's by almost 600% over the same time period. European nations still rely on the military strength of the United States, which was responsible for 70% of NATO defense spending last year. But last year, America's defense spending was 3.1% of GDP, which is very nearly the lowest since the Second World War. Even if you add in the aid to Taiwan, Israel, and Ukraine, America's defense spending would still be far, far below 4.6% of GDP, the amount spent during the height of Iraq and Afghanistan operations in 2010. Although it's on the lower end historically, increasing spending isn't the U.S. military's only concern. The past few decades show that we are unprepared to increase munitions production at the scale and at the speed to win a large war. In the Gulf and in the Iraq wars, it took over 2 years for our munitions procurement and deliveries to reach the necessary levels. And once these crises ended, and demand for munitions dropped, we again sidelined production, and we cut our workforce. We need to build up the weapon stockpiles required to deter, or if necessary, fight and win a conflict against a peer adversary. To do so, we must commit to sustained increases in munitions and weapons production. Tools like multi-year procurement, authority for additional munitions, which we included in this year's NDAA, can contribute to that long-term stability. This boom and bust cycle we have of production has put the United States dangerously behind adversaries like China and Russia, whose capacity to build and replace equipment far outpace ours right now. Take, for example, a war game that was recently conducted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In the hypothetical scenario where war breaks out over Taiwan, China could replace lost naval ships 3 times as quickly as the United States. And if Russia wins in Ukraine, it could rearm itself completely in 3 to 4 years. The nation's finance ministry estimates that national defense spending will grow to 6% of its economic output next year, increasing by 2%. That 6% would be the highest level since the downfall of the Soviet Union. The UK has gone the opposite direction. The nation hasn't had a fully deployable army in over 30 years, and its defense spending is stuck at 2.2%. Britain has pledged to increase that number by a meager 0.3%, but only when economic conditions allow. And unfortunately, industrial capacity will always lag behind spending. Even if Britain and other nations of Europe massively increased defense spending today, it would be years before we saw that spending translated into an increase in production capacity. And by then, it could be too late. Madam President, a new axis is forming. Russia and China have pledged new levels of cooperation, and both have humming military production machines. Our allies must invest more in their defense. They must prepare themselves for what's coming, but they will not be alone. Russia's war on Ukraine has highlighted a weakness in our collective security. When the next crisis arises, NATO will be unequipped to respond. But we cannot allow our alliance to remain unprepared. Instead, we must make the necessary, sustained investments, and we must start making them now. The United States must do everything in our power to accelerate our own production, and we must strongly encourage Europe to do the same. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.